Yes, take your IOUs.
9:27.
Oh, my goodness.
Thank you, Kathleen. If everyone wants to go ahead and have a seat,
Now we can gather.
We bought a brand new, that Santa Fe that I drive.
Uh,
Santa Fe that I drive. When we bought it, I noticed this way it never came with Sirius XM radio. And like when I got the loan for the car, it was like, what is your work phone number? And I didn't think it.
everybody ready? You're quick. You must have gone to Catholic school. Me too.
We got a big clock
Me
here.
too.
We got to
Me
run
too.
run by the clock.
Amy, you ready? Is this Amy? You ready? Super. Yes.
Stress the importance of the microphones.
Yes.
No, we share.
as a preliminary, if everyone would just remember to talk into the microphones, and you almost have to be on top of them, so that this will be recorded. Otherwise, you won't get picked up. Okay, so good morning. This is a scheduled meeting, joint session here. It is May 30th, 2019, and it's 9 a.m. If we could, 9:30. It's 9:30. If everyone could start, Michael, could we start with you? If we'll just say your names for the record, introduce yourselves.
Yes, this is Michael O'Hara. I am the Regional Administrator for the FAA Southern Region. Happy to be here this morning.
Thank you. It's nice to have you here. Chubby, best name ever.
Chevy Moton, Operations Support Group. I'm the acting South Team Manager.
Thank you. It's good to have you here.
Good morning, Jeff Mulder. I'm Lee County Port Authority Executive Director and RSW.
Mr. Mulder, it's good to have you here too.
Bruce Butcher, Fort Myers Beach Town Council.
It's good to have you here, Bruce.
Good morning, everybody. Joe Molson, Air Traffic Manager, Fort Myers.
Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. Rob Johnson, Air Traffic Operations Supervisor at Fort Myers.
You have a calm and cool disposition for that. Huh? I can't imagine.
Roxanne Hassefrost, Town Council.
Anita Saracida.
John Poland, AIR. I'm here as a resource because I'm a pilot.
And Joanne Champ, Town Council.
Kathleen.
And I'm Kathleen Bergen. I'm the Communications Manager for the FAA.
So thank you all for being here. Gentlemen, is there anybody back there that we should know? Let's
Yes, Mark Fisher.
gentlemen, yeah. Can we have your just come? As a matter of fact, you want to go right there and say your name for the record, and we'd love to have you here at the table because there's plenty of room.
Yeah, there's one here, there's one down there.
Perfect.
Yeah.
See, you're trying to sneak out of this. There you. Good morning, Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark Fisher. I'm the Deputy Executive Director in charge of development for the Lee County Port Authority.
I'm Tyler Brown. I'm the Noise and Airspace Project Coordinator for the Lee County Port Authority.
Okay. Thank you all for being here this morning, and I'm going to now turn this over to Joanne Champ.
Please let the record reflect that Vice Mayor Murphy is not able to attend.
Yes, Mr. Murphy will not be in attendance this morning due to a family illness.
Good morning. Is my mic working all right? Amy? Am I good? Are you recording me? It's not good enough, huh? Let me move it better. Now? All right. You know what? I'm going to do what I can. Let's just get started. First of all, on behalf of the entire town council and the Fort Myers Beach community, I do want to send our appreciation to Jeff Mulder, his entire administrative staff at RSW, Lee County Port Authority, and the BOCC, because we've had a positive and effective cooperative relationship with them, and especially, thank you, over the last 18 months, we've had joint meetings that have been very successful. And behind the scenes, I know that Jeff and his team have been working at an April 31st meeting with airline representatives, and progress has been made. And we still feel there's work to be done, and we really appreciate you, Mr. O'Hara, coming. As I said, inviting you was just hopefully that the FAA can help support this team, who I think is working hard to be good partners with us. We love RSW. They're the backbone of our economy down here and of our lifestyle, to be able to come and go so well out of this paradise to other parts of the world. And so we do want to work just as good partners. And so we're hopeful today that anything that transpires here is just a good partnership. This short PowerPoint is just really intended to give a little bit of where we were, where we are, and where we're going. So RSW moved to its current location in 1983. And at that time, Fort Myers Beach was already built out. And you can see the town council members. That's the runway. It's runway 6 when you're coming this direction. It's runway 24 when you come this direction. So that single runway, the center of which is aligned with Fort Myers Beach. We are a barrier island off the lee coast. The red circles indicate the controlled airspace. Fort Myers Beach is actually 12 nautical miles from the runway at Regional Southwest. And the aircraft primarily flew down the west coast of Florida on that blue line known as the tiny star arrival route. Very few, if any, aircraft ever came to runway 6 over Fort Myers Beach at that time because the aircraft turned well east of our community. Because of aircraft noise complaints at Fiddlesticks, which is actually here, the runway 6 intercept moved from 3 miles to 7 miles in 1998. And aircraft flying over Fort Myers Beach increased from near zero to about 33% at that point. The town did complain to RSW, and we were assured that there would be no railroad track over our community and that aircraft would be at over 3,000 feet. In fact, there was a town council meeting. Anita, you might have been mayor at that time. It was April 20th, 1998, with the Lee County Port Authority and the FAA reps, and they did state that the goal was to spread the noise impact and that they cannot establish a railroad track over any one community. Historically, as you can see on the left, pre what was called FLOCAR, the arrival route down the west coast of Florida had two areas of conflict that the FAA wanted to eliminate during its redesign. Arrivals were divided into two traffic flows on the right, the existing Tiny Star, which is the blue line, and the new Shifty One Star, the yellow line, that directed aircraft down the center of the state. And of course, the modem of approach pattern moved the conflict to you-know-where, right near Fort Myers Beach. So the town of Fort Myers Beach at that time passed Resolution 0903, requesting relief. Shifty One Star directed aircraft down the center of the state from the east, with the aircraft flying south of the airport, heading west toward the Gulf of Mexico and in a downwind leg and turning back toward 6. So it comes here, down, around, and back to land on 6. The south end of Estero Island, for the first time south, saw overflights on the south end of the island. At that time, too, the Estero Council of Community Leaders, ECCL, contacted the Secretary of Transportation, and within 1 year, Shifty One Star changed to Shifty Two Star. And air traffic controllers sent flights further out over the Gulf, turning back to the runway. And ATC was no longer allowed at that time to let aircraft turn over uninhabited Estero Bay. This change meant that all aircraft flying the Shifty arrival route to runway 6 had to fly over Fort Myers Beach. So our overflights increased to as high as 90% of all arrivals to runway 6, with over 50% flying over a 1-mile section in the middle of Estero Island. And at that point, we passed Resolution 1202, requesting relief. So what was promised would not happen to Fort Myers Beach, indeed, unfortunately, is what did happen to Fort Myers Beach. We have a railroad track created over our community. We had low-flying aircraft over Fort Myers Beach, and we had many aircraft over Fort Myers Beach late at night and early in the morning. In 2013, RSW completed the Federal Aviation Regulations FAR Part 150 noise study, and Fort Myers Beach passed Resolution 1301, seeking relief. When the RSW web track system became available in March 2013, the impacts of these issues for Fort Myers Beach could begin to be quantified. And in fact, in the period since that time, our air committee has logged and evaluated over 50,000 flights to evaluate the data and provide support for our concerns. And at this point, actually, we would like to recognize RSW for the transparency of their web track system. It has been very helpful to us in the community in understanding what the issues are with the airport and how we can communicate to the airport our needs. This is an example. Here's a picture of the problem from the web track. The railroad track creator of our community, unfortunately, is relentless. It's all day and all night. Here's an example just before midnight in good weather, flying at 1,500 feet over the highly residential area, despite the fact that we're 12 nautical miles from RSW on a direct visual approach. And we question why. Fort Myers Beach has attempted to be data-driven in its request for relief from the inequitable burden we feel that we're placed on us with the overflights. The town of Fort Myers Beach passed another resolution, 1709, requesting that the RNAV visual back bay approach be made public. And with help from Dennis Roberts, who was then the FAA Regional Administrator, and his staff, and 2 years of evaluation and training, use of the RNAV back bay approach to runway 6 was made available to ATC and pilots and implemented in October of 2017. And that is this blue line coming from Shifty down, but now they can come behind, over the back bay, behind our island to 06. The RNAV back bay approach at least provided the relief to take us back to 2008 when FlowCar was implemented. So here's the performance data. And we had a meeting with RSW and FAA before we compared our data. And the data was very comparable. We're very confident in the data as we discuss it, just to let you know. So when you look at all arrivals based on this 50,000 flights by our air group, FlowCar, obviously, for all arrivals prior to FlowCar in the top line, you can see prior to FlowCar we were maybe at 33%, and with all of it coming from the north. Shifty was not there then. After FlowCar, all arrivals, we wound up at 73% of all arrivals coming over our island, 54% and 54% of the tinies, and 90% of the Shifty arrivals. Now, after the Back Bay route was implemented in October 2017, in the last 17 months, we have shown improvement, and that's what the wording in the red blocks show. So all arrivals were down to 49%. The north arrivals on Tiny were at about 49%, and the Shifty arrivals from the south are 49%. And of course, that's the most significant improvement because that dropped from 90% to 49%. You have to remember during the summer, there's about 50 to 60 arrivals per day, and in season, there's over 200 arrivals per day. So that's a high percentage at our lunch, dinner, and late night. And because of an increase in conflict in season, those percentages can increase as well. So we have a lot of flights, and they're consistent over our island. Consistent and persistent. So the railroad track, this is current railroad track of aircraft that was created by FlowCar, and it's continued even after implementation of RNAV. But as stated previously, about 49% of the aircraft now are flying over the island after the implementation of the Back Bay route. And if you look at this 55% is all flights. And it's divided, 49% is all flights. And of that 49%, about half is still over the center of the island, 15% over this end of the island, and 28% over this end of the island. And then on the north route, about 25%, south route, about 25%. With ATC trying to keep the flights 3,500 feet apart at landing, we experience flights about every 2 minutes over our homes and businesses. And keep in mind, it's a big change because we didn't have any aircraft when we were fully developed before the airport was here. It's a huge change for our community. I'm going to shift gears now from the number of flights to the altitude of flights. And after FlowCar, about 1/3 of Fort Myers Beach overflights were below 3,000 feet. Almost 5% were below 2,000 feet, and some as low as 1,400 feet. And after implementation of the RNAV Back Bay approach, it reduced the number of overflights, but it has created a significant increase in the percentage of aircraft below 3,000 feet, and particularly below 2,000 feet. For example, 41% and 14% are 41% under 3,000 feet, 14.8% under 2,000 feet. Respectively. Much of the percentage increase is coming from the Shifty approach because aircraft are not starting their turn to the airport soon enough to avoid flying over the island. So they're already in descent. And by delaying the turn, the flights are coming right down the center spine of our island. So they're low and coming down the spine of the island. You only need one flight at 1,400 feet with their gear down to have complaints. So the RNAV approach plate to 06, we think, should be raised to 3,000 feet, as the ILS is. The preferred runway, we're going to evaluate now all daytime and nighttime arrival data. So this one is not all just over Fort Myers Beach. This is all arrival data. The RSW Noise Compatibility Program recommendation in the most recent Part 150 report states that runway 24 will be preferred from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And RSW was to train Miami ATC in this matter, and I believe that they've attempted to do so. The Table 3 data confirms that runway 24, however, is not preferred during the nighttime at this point. It doesn't really see any difference before or after implementation of the RNAV Back Bay approach. So data shows that the performance is much poorer when Miami ATC is in control from midnight to 6 a.m. The fact is that Miami is landing planes by the thousands and maybe is not listening or doesn't have the time or doesn't understand the impact for our island or our little area. But if you look at on the left side, the daytime after flow car, we were getting 68%, and at nighttime 67%, and the current performance still has not changed from 65 to 66%. And the nighttime, you can see, has not changed appreciably either, although it is higher when Miami is in control for all flights. Now, at the next slide, this is the flights that actually cross our community. The flights that cross our community, the percentage of aircraft overflights shows that the same improvement with implementation of the RNAV Back Bay approach for both day and night arrivals. The improvement from 10 p.m. to midnight when RSW ATC is in control is much improved. RSW is clearly trying to implement the use of runway 24 at night. But the overflight performance from midnight to 7 a.m. when Miami ATC is in control shows no improvement, even with the RNAV Back Bay implementation, is much poorer when Miami is in control. And our requests are, to us, seem simple, but we're not managing the air control. And I'm sure if you're up in the tower, it doesn't seem so simple, but I'm going to tell you simply what we would like. The town of Fort Myers Beach would like the total number of overflights, not just the percentages, reduced, and we're wondering how that could be done. If we look at the downwind approach patterns for runway 6 versus runway 24, we may get some indication. Looking at the approach plate for the downwind approach to runway 6, it is a mirror image of the approach plate for the downwind approach to 24. So here's 6, here's 24, 7% are coming here, 49% are coming here, 50% are coming here. On 24, 76% come here, 19.9% are here, 3.2% are here. This position here is highly commercial. These positions are residential. The distribution of actual arrivals, as you can see, is significantly different. While the arrival routes downwind to 24 and 6 should mirror, in reality, aircraft continue to fly about 14 miles further in RSW airspace when landing downwind on 6 compared to downwind to 24. And prior to RNAV Back Bay implementation, the aircraft actually flew about 18 miles further. So the Back Bay has improved the fuel consumption and the time in the air for the airlines by using the RNAV Back Bay. The distance comparison translates to significantly longer times, as we said, in the airspace, increased fuel consumption, and huge impacts to our community's quality of life and health. With data showing it's safe to land on 24 with intercepts at 3 miles, why does RSW and the FAA inflict a burden on us? That's what it feels like when we look at the data. Why isn't the approach to 6 laid out as the same to 24, and why aren't flights downwind to 06 released earlier? Fort Myers Beach would see a significant reduction in overflights if arrival to runway 06 were allowed to follow patterns like arrival to 24, the same release point and intercept distances from the runway. In reality, this would put the majority of flights over a primarily commercial corridor. This would require two things: change the flyover waypoint to the standard pattern of beam the runway, and allow ATC to release clear to land at the flyover waypoint. And number two, move the intercept back to 3 nautical miles. The benefits of this are great. Overflights for not only the town of Fort Myers Beach, but the village of Estero, Bonita Springs, and San Carlos Park would all be reduced. Aircraft redirected over areas would be zoned commercial rather than residential, and there's a decreased distance and time flown by aircraft in the RSW airspace. There's a significant savings for the airlines, and I think it was Southwest saved $1 million on their first experiment. Jeff, you can correct me that if I'm wrong. Increased capacity for RSW potentially, and decreased stress for ATC potentially. Easy for me to say. Low altitude over Fort Myers Beach becomes less of an issue, and the nighttime overflights for Fort Myers Beach become less of an issue, and from our points of view, we think it's a win-win-win-win-win for everybody. Secondly, we'd like to require all aircraft to fly above 3,000 feet over Estero Island. We're 12 nautical miles out, and whether they're flying under VFR or IFR conditions, they should be able to stay at 3,000 feet. Third, we'd like continuous training of ATC and pilots to stay above 3,000 feet, implement an optimized profile descent, and change the RSW RNAV approach plate to runway 6 to be the same as the ILS approach plate and higher. With the optimized profile, you'd throttle back at 50 to 100 nautical miles out and glide. Be quieter and glide. It'd be higher, and you can get from 4,000 feet to the gate quickly. That actually puts us at more at about 3,600 feet as flights come over us. In Fort Lauderdale, just showing their profiles for the ILS and the RNAV compared to ours. We've got 3,000 and 2,000. They've got 3,000 on both. We would like both flight plates to match, the RNAV and the ILS to match. It can be safely done in our community, for our community. In fact, according to commercial pilots we've just talked to that fly into RSW, that glide slope at 20 nautical miles out from RSW can be picked up at 3,600 feet with low engine settings. And finally, have pilots in ATC and RSW and Miami Center commit to making runway 24 the preferred runway from 10 to 7. And I think that RSW has obviously shown a commitment. They've made some improvement. It's not as much as we would like to see. We recognize that pilots, for a variety of reasons, weather and otherwise, are going to request to come across 6, maybe just familiarity, whatever. But we really feel that Part 150 needs to be enacted and implemented stronger. We would never ask for flights to be altered for weather. Obviously, we expect weather conditions to dictate safety first. At this point, I'd like to actually give a handout to you. Mr. O'Hara. This is just sort of a general big package for you to take home, Mr. Mulder. And I didn't give everybody that, but and for let's see. If we want to pass these out, these are the sort of what I would say is our asks. I'll pass these out in this direction. So with just a little more detail on the slides. The RNAV approaches and arrivals are increasing throughout the ATC system, and RNAV increases the potential for railroad track impacts. We recognize that, and that's why we want to have this discussion now. We're already a railroad track, and the RNAV system could, how things are implemented will make a difference for our community. In reality, the LENP, which is the RNAV, and the Tropic ILS are already co-located at 6 miles to descend to 1,500 feet final approach fix. That allows an altitude as high as 3,600 feet at LENP, which RNAV, and Tropic ILS. And that definitely keeps flights over 3,000 feet over our community, even when they cross our island. So if you increase the RNAV 6 LENP fix mandatory from 2,000 to 3,000 feet, that would be a huge improvement for our community. Secondly, publish noise abatement procedures to ATIS, AWOS, and NOTAMs, that it's a noise-sensitive area, no less than 3,000 feet. The next sheet then just indeed shows that Tropic is, the ILS Tropic right now is already set at 3,000 feet, and we would like LENP, the RNAV, set the same. The next sheet then regard to the number of aircraft flying over the beach. We would like ATC to continue to utilize the Back Bay Visual Runway 6 and the RNAV Visual Runway 6. And what we'd like is an earlier release on the downwind, aim for a 5-mile final at about 1,500 feet above the airport. That will save time and fuel and keeps the airplanes over unpopulated areas. And this was a note from commercial pilots that we work with. The shifty arrivals from the north-northeast route is actually inefficient for time, fuel, and they are low overpopulated areas. It's bad for the pilots and the community. Runway 6 arrivals are much better on Tiny or Joseph, especially when RNAV Visual 6 or Bay Visual 6 is utilized. So the next couple of pages show, and especially for the town council, I'm not showing them on the screen right now, it's in your handout, show the Back Bay routes. And the Back Bay Visual Runway 6 and the RNAV Visual to Runway 6 are demonstrated there. And you can see they're very effective routes, but only if the release downwind is correctly timed. Otherwise, the flights come down the spine of our island rather than in the Back Bay, which is unpopulated. I've included a couple of other of the shifty RNAV routes and things like that, just for your quick reference. But I'm going to go a couple pages back now, and we're going to talk about 24 being the preferred runway from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. and changing the RS noise compatibility by changing the noise compatibility program recommendation, provide continuous training for pilots, RSW, ATC, and initiate continuous training of Miami Center. So we are also requesting perhaps that the noise abatement procedures, if they aren't already, be published to ATIS, AWOS, and NOTAMs, saying that there's a noise-sensitive area, this is for nighttime, no less than 3,000 feet, and nighttime runway 24 preferred. And also, pilots were saying you might communicate to freight carriers, especially somebody like FedEx, if you go to the next couple pages later, then in reality, when they use 24, they can go straight to their terminal rather than taxiing back. And that conversation may help them to decide to actually use that route, runway 24. The last thing, I'm going to ask you to go to the last couple pages of your handout that I just gave you. And what it says is the Fort Myers Beach mitigation request for noise and quality of life, actionable, feasible recommendations. And obviously this was with assistance from commercial pilots. I did not come up with this myself. So I'm going to just read them into the record. Number 1, approach control TRACON should utilize RNAV Visual 06 ground track and altitude constraints as template for vectoring arrivals to visual or instrument approaches. The result, it maximizes over bay tracks. Number 2, for aircraft that are vectored over the Gulf, approach control should direct aircraft to intercept glide slope at or above 4,000 feet. This will result in aircraft beginning a gradual descent at approximately 13 miles from RSW. Overflight of Fort Myers Beach would occur at 3,600 feet with aircraft thrust sound at reduced levels. Number 3, increase crossing constraint at LENP to 3,000 feet. LENP is co-located with Tropic ILS 06, which has a 3,000-foot constraint. Number 4, allow exceptions to flow car to allow inbound northeast traffic to intercept approaches from the north of RSW, preferably directly to SOKI for RNAV visual or vectors to final. Currently, all northeast arrivals must fly shifty arrival to south of RSW. More direct SOKI routing is more efficient, less time-consuming, and is less noise-sensitive. These are from pilots that fly the east route all the time. Approach control allows shifty arrival to turn base leg well before the Ponte fix. This would allow shorter approach, less flight time, and turn over less noise-sensitive areas. And number 6, utilize runway 24 more in no wind or low tailwind conditions. Have the tower approach control in Miami Center encourage runway 24 use, and add runway 24's preferred runway to ASOS, AWOS, and NOTAMs. I think that should be AT, I don't know, to alert pilots well in advance, especially for non-tower operations. And then the results: shorter taxi to gates, cargo ramp, less maneuvering to set up for final for the majority of traffic from the north. The RNAV GPS 24 provides vertical and lateral guidance, and there's lower noise impacts. So that is, I tried to get as much information as I could to you, to what we're thinking with the help of those who know better than I as a town council person. And we appreciate this conversation. Before I close, I would just like to say, that we understand that Next Gen is coming, Metroplex is coming. I'm not sure that RSW is involved in the Metroplex conversation at this point. The approach routes for RSW will be coming if different approach routes will be coming if a second runway is put in at RSW. And what our town wants, and what we've always wanted, is just to be a cooperative partner in these conversations, that we converse in advance, that we recognize what the impacts will be, that we get to share them with other communities and not have the unequitable burden, and that we all continue to enjoy this Southwest Florida paradise and share it with the world by the utilization of RSW Airport. And I can't thank each of you enough for being here, and each of you enough for anything that you can do to help our town without harming our surrounding areas and providing efficient functioning of RSW for, frankly, travelers from around the world. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Joanne, that was dynamite.
My poor husband has been listening to this for a while. He said, "You didn't get elected to become an air traffic controller, did you?" I said, "No, I really didn't." So at this point, I also wanted to give you, Mr. O'Hara, just copies of all these resolutions that we've passed over the years, just showing that we have politely and gently been asking for relief. And so I turn it over to you, Mr. Mulder, Mr. O'Hara, anyone we can for comment. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jeff.
Maybe the first question that you had, one of the questions you had was, where does Metroplex stand?
Yes.
And I think that's probably a good place to start, Michael. I know there were some initial discussions, but I don't know the timing and schedule at this point.
Certainly. And Joanne, I want to thank you for such a well thought out.
Just for a moment, because I would really be negligent to say that the person who helped me is our Citizen of the Year, who was appointed that for his tireless work on this topic. He is out of the country now, flew out of RSW to Europe and was unable to attend, and his name is Tom Babcock, and I just want to say on the record thank you to him, because he's that 50,000 points of data with John and everybody else. So I'm sorry. Back to you, sir.
I understand it's a team approach, a lot of community energy, and I just want to say thank you. At some point I was thinking, surely she must have been over at the facility working at some point, but I guess this is on.
Yeah, we never know. When we have these little roundtable discussions, it's an awful. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
And Mayor, thank you for the invitation.
Oh,
I
for
appreciate
heaven's
the
sakes,
entire
we're thrilled
council
you guys are here.
giving us the opportunity to come.
Thank you, sir.
I actually believe the first letter I got when I came back into the regional administrator position may not have literally been the first letter, but it may have been the first letter, was from then Vice Mayor Champ, sharing some of the background, talking about the partnership that had existed between Fort Myers Beach and the FAA. Now I hear me. And I just appreciate that. And then we had a follow-up. I think we had a follow-up letter. We were in a shutdown, and none of that's an excuse. I just want to acknowledge that, and I mean persistent in a good way, but Joanne has been persistent in encouraging the FAA to...
We all know her.
to be a part of the conversation and vice versa. I do also, and I certainly acknowledge that two of my predecessors have spent time here. I think Doug Murphy was down at one point, or perhaps multiple occasions. He would have been the regional administrator during some of the flow car implementation, I believe. And I know there's some correspondence on that. And I know Dennis Roberts was down and shared some history, which I reached out to him last year. He's since retired, but I reached out to Dennis last year, and he gave me some history of the correspondence, which was helpful. I also want to recognize Jeff as Executive Director for Lee County Port Authority, and I know that he has been a great partner. We've heard positive feedback. Jeff and I have shared common geography in the past, and certainly any solution involves the broader FAA team, the airport, and communities. That truly is the model that you're seeing in the FAA more around the country with our projects. We are going further with community involvement than some of the environmental laws require, and I don't mean that to toot our horn, but we recognize that we don't want to set up battlegrounds with communities. As you said, Joanne, and as we would assert, and I know as Jeff, I believe, would assert, airports are vital to communities. I've seen several points of data from the Florida Airport Council on the economic benefits to the state. Florida is unique, and I say that. We've been doing, and I'm not on Metroplex. I'll get right back to that in a second, but thanks for letting me wander for a moment. But Florida is the only state out of 50 that has 4 large hub international airports. And Florida is by far the busiest state of aviation activity within my part of the world, but within the United States. So there's a good bit of focus on the activity. There's some growth in the state. There are benefits. As I started to mention, Florida Airports Council said 49%, I believe is the number I saw, of travelers into the state come in by air, and I realize that's important. I think there are common points that we all want to support that, and then also realize the experience they have once they're on the ground, as well as the residents here, is as positive as it can be, and the type of partnership you're describing is a critical part of that. So back to Metroplex, that's part of the agency's efforts to modernize the airspace. We have 11 projects around the country where we're doing these large-scale procedure improvements. We've completed 7 of those, and we went through a rescoping, a downsizing of the scoping of that project that was announced early in 2018. It was about the same week your letter came in. I'd been in my job 4 or 5 weeks, so I know they were both around the same time. I think we had a call late January. You wrote a letter in the 5th of February, if I recall. I probably have it with me. And there wasn't an intent to exclude anybody, and I don't know that that negatively impacts Fort Myers, and I wouldn't say that if I didn't believe it, but let me say a little bit more about that. The Florida project, as it was originally described or envisioned, and given the context I mentioned with 4 uniquely positioned 4 international air carrier hubs in Tampa, Orlando, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, the scope was, I don't want to exaggerate. I know it was at least twice the size. I don't know if you know that number, Chubby. It could have been even more than that, but it was twice the size in terms of number of procedures and scope of any other of the 10 Metroplex projects. And that project is funded with deadlines for implementation, and I don't know if that makes sense, but I'll try to just plain speak. The project funding goes away at a certain point in time. We're given a window to implement the project, and it's 2021. And we had to scale the project back in order to have any shot at being successful with even a part of it. And so much like we have Metroplex projects focused on places like Las Vegas, Cleveland, Detroit, Denver, we, FAA, made the decision to focus on those major international hubs. So that was our decision. And I mentioned Fort Myers Beach. It doesn't mean that we can't look at enhancements and improvements at procedures. What it means is they won't be part of that Metroplex initiative. I'm also comfortable saying, and we can quiz any of the folks who know a little bit more about this than I do, but I don't believe the changes we're making in Fort Lauderdale and Miami will have any effect on Fort Myers. And I think that question was raised at one point. So the approach is headed toward Fort Lauderdale, if I didn't say that right. Approaches into Fort Lauderdale and Miami, I believe, are 25 to 31,000. There's probably a better number than that, but we're not talking low altitude changes. We're not talking, in my opinion, and again, if anybody's more familiar with those changes than I am, I've been in 18 public workshops, so I know a little bit about them in the last 6 weeks. I'm comfortable saying that. So on the one hand, Fort Myers is not part of Metroplex. That project is moving forward on a downscoped basis, and I don't believe the impacts to those other airports will have any impact. I also don't know that we would have made the types of changes that are ideally or being requested for Fort Myers, because a lot of those procedures, for example, in Tampa, are not below 10,000 feet because we're avoiding major environmental studies. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the project. Some of what you're looking for is use of satellite-based technology, more accurate procedures, the flexibilities that get us off of straight-in approaches, and we'll go there. I am going to turn it over to Chevy in a couple minutes. He's probably wondering when. So you gave us a lot to think about. Is that okay on Metroplex? Does that give is that enough of an overview? I'm happy to take questions or dive in.
Well, we had sort of heard that, and now we know it for sure.
You can believe that is the case, and we will not even in a case like that where we have the resources and we're focused, we're still not implementing those procedures until 2021. Very rarely is this an overnight flip of the switch and we say, hey, let's start doing this next week. That may sound discouraging, but I also have to manage expectations a little bit, but I think the partnership is key. I also want to be mindful of the clock. So you've given us a lot to think about. You've talked about track data. You've talked about elevations. I'm not going to recap.
Right.
What we wanted to do, and I think we actually have some slides if we can put those up, but we wanted to share some updates on some of the efforts we've seen internally. I want to be very careful to not say we came in and we want to say what we came in to say, because our intent of this meeting was to begin, at least under my term, this partnership and to listen. And if I came in saying we had all the answers before we listened, that's not who I am. So I'm going to be digesting handouts beyond my time at the microphone. But again, truly appreciate the information that you've shared. So we're going to share some updates on where we've been. I don't know how deep we need to go on some of the challenges, because I believe everybody involved in the presentation has a pretty good handle on a lot of those, but we'll talk a little bit about the challenges, highlight a couple successes, and then share some potential opportunities, which I think overlap some that Joanne mentioned in her briefing. Dennis Roberts came from an executive position in headquarters in charge of airspace design. Michael O'Hara, self-speaking, I don't normally call me by name, did not. So Dennis might stand or might have stood before you and said we can do A, B, C, D, and E, and F and G are possible. I rely on some other experts, and I am an engineer. I've been at the FAA my entire career for all practical purposes, but I don't have his specific background. Nonetheless, I'm encouraged by the discussions we've had with our team internally over the last several weeks in preparation. So I also know Florida in general has seen an increase. I wish I had that number right in my head, but there has been an increased amount of traffic within the state, and that possibly contributes, although there's a blend of percentages and then a request for a reduced total number. Sort of like percentages are percentages, but what we really want is fewer planes. You can work numbers the wrong way. So I think it's not the last you'll hear from me. My team knows that. I think at this point, let me turn it over to Chevy to provide a little bit of the information. Chevy Moton, a little bit of information that we had prepared, and then I want to come back with a couple thoughts after we go through some materials. So Chevy, thank you.
Thanks again for your time. Thanks again for the invitation. Some of the information that we're going to discuss was kind of conveyed in the previous presentation, and thanks again. A lot of great information. Some of that information we kind of looked at. Didn't dive as deep as you did into it, but again, thanks for the presentation. Background, Mr. Ariel just spoke about some of the history on the noise concern for the Fort Myers Beach area. We're going to go and look at some airport matrix, some previous efforts, current procedures. Most of the focus is on runway 6. We did look at a little bit for runway 4 when it talks about the noise abatement plan and the preferred runway. And also we're going to look at the change considerations. One thing we have to be mindful of, any changes, there are certain things, certain impacts, so that sometimes limits our ability to make certain changes. And some of the mitigations or some of the discussions we are already underway at the regional office. This graphic just basically shows the operations per year dating back to 2015, and as you indicate, there's been a steady increase of traffic over that time frame. Part of this discussion, as you can see, is more of a seasonal, even though there's an increase there during the time starting about February till about April. That seems to be when most of your traffic, and so that seems to be going up from year to year. And for 2018 and 19, like I said, we just did it for the portion of the year that we had available. So the operations are increasing.
Excuse me, what does operations mean?
That is total number of flights. So going in and out of Southwest region. And like I said, if anytime I kind of forget sometime the audience, if you have any questions or anything, please stop me. Previous effort to address the noise concern. We did look at a proposal to move the initial approach fix for the approaches closer to the airport. That was discussed and reviewed. Part of that, when they sent it through criteria, and what they're looking at that is they have reference software. Any changes that's made to a procedure, I want to make sure I'm not getting an echo here, or procedure approach, they have reference software that can run the program through it. And if they get an error message, they have to evaluate those error messages. Sometimes what they have to do is look at the error message and see if it's something just a required change where they can just make an adjustment. Some of those can be mitigated without going through the waiver process. But when they looked at the procedure here, it was a little bit more involved. So, and also there was industry concerns related to the descent profile. And that's where the aircraft actually are coming over to point at a higher altitude adjustment into the surrounding airport. So that's something they had to be aware of also. As we talked earlier about, they were looking at the required navigation performance, RNP, and that was part of the Metroplex discussion. It was considered, and after, like I said, scoping, budgetary constraints, it was RSW, as well as some other airports were removed from the Metroplex discussion.
Chevy, if I could jump in just with a sentence there. I know I mentioned that it's not a deal breaker in my opinion for Fort Myers. I was in Louisville last week. It's not Metroplex. We're looking at implementing improved procedures and efficiencies within that airspace. That's why I made the comment I did. Just because you're not in the Florida Metroplex doesn't mean that we can't have a similar or comparable look at procedures. We have to work it in with resources and availability, and I just don't want to overcommit, but I'm telling you we can legitimately look at that.
And there was an attempt to expand the usability of the air navigation automatic visual approach to runway 6 to all certified and properly equipped aircraft. That was not implemented due to limited operational use, and that some of that had to do with the aircraft equipment suffix and the usage at the time. So that's something that's still on the plate. We can look at that also, but at the time it was not due to limited use. Previous effort, develop and implemented the Bay Visual to runway 6 procedure. You mentioned that earlier. We did raise the initial approach fixed altitude on the ILS to 3,000 feet. And runway 24 was made the preferred runway during the midnight operation. Now that is actually captured in the procedures for both RSW and for Miami. So that information is there. But one thing you have to remember about that, the prevailing runway is determined by the winds. And based on what we saw as trends for winds for the local area, runway 6 was used roughly about 2/3 of the time. So be aware of that. And also because of aircraft requests, even though they maybe want to go to 2-4 maybe to advertise, but if they have a request, 6, sometimes we honor those requests also. Current procedures to runway 6, like I said, most of the focus we talked about runway 6. We have the instrument approach landing 6 or the ILS approach procedures. We have the global positioning system or GPS approach procedure, the back bay visual. Also, we have the preferred runway use program, and that's during the hours of 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. runway at 6 is and the voluntary noise abatement procedure. And that deals with both RSW and Miami. And it has to do with the altitude, where they request for the altitude of the aircraft to be at 3,000 feet when they actually cross the final approach phase. Also, there's periodic training on noise. Anytime we see any variance or any maybe concerns, there's a refocus on make sure controllers, staff, or whoever is involved is given periodic training on those. So that's not scheduled. Most of the time it's just if we see something that requires, we take an opportunity and we look at it also. This is just a traffic pattern, and this kind of goes back to, it's become important when a little bit later on, as you were talking earlier, the typical aircraft come in from the procedure, they will proceed on the downwind, depending on the layout. They're going to turn in to base. Going to turn into base and then going to go final into the runway. So that's just there for illustration, and it'll be a little bit more apparent with the next slide. Can everyone hear me okay? As we discussed earlier, this is the tiny and the shifty arrival. These are the two supported procedures for RSW. Tiny comes in, most of the aircraft that are coming here are going to be coming from the middle of the state and west. They're going to come in on the tiny. They're going to come in on the, this is going to be the base leg, and then they're coming in. If they're going to runway 6, they're going to turn the final here, come in. And if they're going to 2-4, they're going to come in and go out here on the downwind, and then base, and then back to final. This is shifty, which is coming down on the east coast. Aircraft coming toward over the LaBelle area. They're going to be coming here, going in on the downwind, turning base, and then going back in on the ILS to runway 6. And that shows kind of geographical areas. They're coming into the area where the aircraft, the typical traffic pattern. And also, if you look here on this, is the altitudes. The aircraft coming in here at 4,000 feet. Aircraft coming in here at 4,000 feet. And the reason that is important for air traffic, we got the two main flows aircraft are coming in at the same altitude, and at times that will require, maybe have to make some adjustment, turning the aircraft in a little bit sooner, a little bit forward out to make sure we maintain the appropriate spacing and require separation. So that's where that's important. This is just a 2019, just a slide that shows all the departures and arrivals for the area from February 11th through the 17th. And the indication is this, you see this is a busy airport. A lot of tracks, a lot of air, a lot of traffic, and different times of the day and everything. You can see a variance of where the actual tracks are coming in, so you're going to see some of that. This is procedures for runway 6. This is one day in February. And you can see where the air, I'm sorry. You just see where the aircraft are coming in, and they're actually turning in. you want to see it here is if they're, the blue, the indication is roughly 4,000 feet. Right as they go from blue to green, that is going to be the 3,000 feet point. Anything in the green is going to be 3 and below, and when you get to red, from green to red, that's going to be the point where they go from 3,000 feet to 2,000 feet. So that's the illustration there. It kind of gives you a general idea of what the traffic, the patterns, and the altitude.
So when it's green, is it below 3,000 feet?
Well, the way you look at it is when it changes from blue to green, that's going to be the point that they're at 3,000 feet. So when they get into green, it could be anything from 3 to 2.
Okay.
So blue is 3 to 4, green is 2 to 3. And so as Chubby said, when you see it go from blue to green, that's going to be your 3,000 point. Green to red, you're going to be hitting passing through 2,000, right? That's a typical day. I don't think we picked that because of any reason.
We just picked a day. We were looking at.
It's easier to look at a day than it is the prior slide that has too much spaghetti on the plate.
So why is it that they drop down to 3 at the beach? Why don't they stay at 4 till they get closer in?
Well, this is tropic. I'm sorry, did I go back to? I guess it's on this slide. So let's see if it's down here. You'll see this is where tropic. That's going to be that point. If you look at it, typically where they're going to be crossing that point at 3,000.
So the 3-degree approach to the runway, and I'm not saying that, I'm just stating a typical 3-degree approach to the runway at 11 miles is within 50 feet, I think, of 3,000 feet. So that there are aircraft looking to begin a 3-degree approach. I think that's a general answer to why some aircraft are at that 3,000 feet.
And some will descend a little bit earlier depending on the turn and just the adjustments. But on average, that's where you see that 3,000 feet at that location.
So who determines the 3 degrees?
That's going to be set up in the procedure, the way the profile is set. If that's where you were talking about the profile is set.
Yeah.
That's routine. Right.
That's just the way the procedure is set.
That's routine.
That's a standard ILS
Yes.
approach. You could ask, is every ILS set at that?
But the real conversation here, of course, is that the ILS is set at 3,000, but the RNAV is only at 2, and so that's our point. If that was established safely at 3 for ILS, why not for RNAV as well?
So, there's several points I'd like to come back to, and that's
Thanks.
probably one we need to explore a bit.
And this is just, we looked at a midnight operation because I know that was part of the conversation. And we did pull a bid shift. And biggest thing you would just see, like I said, it's not near the amount of traffic, but you would just see a little bit of difference how the traffic is run when Miami Center is actually in control of the traffic as opposed to the RSW. One thing to be mindful here, as a center controller, the airspace is going to be a little bit different. There's going to be a bigger range. There's going to be more traffic. There's going to be more traffic scenarios. And some of the separation requirements are different when it comes to the en route environment versus the terminal environment. So that's where you'll see more of a variance sometimes of the tracks. The other thing to be mindful of, on the midship, there's a potential where the controller will probably let the aircraft maybe turn in a little bit sooner, descend a little bit sooner on those areas because their focus is a little bit more on the overall as opposed to the individual craft that is going into RSW. So that you may see a little bit of variance there.
Just using that slide as an illustration. I may run up here because I think it'll be faster. But and I'm making this up, but just as a point, if you had an aircraft on this track here that's descending from the north, and you simultaneously had an aircraft on Shifty, that might cause a scenario that you're extending the downwind. I'm not trying to say something that everybody doesn't know, but that's so you might be extending the downwind and create that the lagging or trailing aircraft is the one that's having to go out and can't make the short turn because of the conflict. we have in our future the tools, and I'm not trying to be silly, but that's one that's not an overnight fix, but part of navigation, part of satellite navigation gives us time-based flow management, and we're not there, and I don't wanna minimize the work that the controllers do, and I appreciate it when Rob's down there shaking his head, but they don't have all the tools to manage that kind of en route so that those conflicts don't occur. They either are resolved as planes depart, or they're on the ground, or while they're en route, they're making speed adjustments. Those tools are coming. That's part of the infrastructure we're building, and that will not only help eliminate some of those conflicts that require that extension, they'll also allow us to increase utilization of some of those procedures that we can't do because of conflicts that exist today with the system.
Yeah, I think we so much recognize all the advantages coming with RNAV, but our concern is that we don't wind up being the RNAV railroad track and at 2,000 feet.
Right. Are you guys comfortable with what I said?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for letting me jump in again, Chevy.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And like you said, one thing to consider with RNAV is, it is a true point that just where you see the variance in some of these patterns, if the aircraft is allowed to fly the procedure as designed, that will be a railroad, so you need to be mindful of that. Change consideration, as we talked about, part of this discussion here, any changes, you gotta be aware of environmental concerns. So, anytime you move tracks or try to readjust the altitudes and everything, so you have to look at it from the perspective of how is it gonna impact the environment, not only where the tracks are now, if we move them, how does that impact the area, and then if we actually set in procedures, or more defined path, that's something we have to be aware of also. And as you're probably aware, there are several airports in the local area, it's a confined area, a lot of tracks, I think on the next slide, we give a depiction of just traffic for Conoco, Fort Myers, Pagefield, Naples, and Marco. And you see a lot of departures and arrivals, and you see that impact. As mentioned earlier, the proximity to the beach, that is something we have to be aware of, the changes and everything. So we got to be aware, anytime we making any changes, there's a limited area just because of the location and the configuration. That is the other thing that you have to be aware of when we're making any changes. Runway 6 and 24. And as always, when we're designing procedures, there's always pilot concerns to make sure the variety, different fleets, most of the aircraft can actually fly the procedures. So we have to be aware of that to make sure we take time to review and to look at it all. Air traffic operation requirements, the controllers. That's something we have to be aware of anytime we design a procedure, the air traffic operation. Because as you say, you can design the procedures, but there's still separation requirements, there's separation standards that we have to be aware of also. So we have to be mindful of that. And as, like I said, the way the operation there at Regional Southwest, since it's only from 6 a.m. to 10 at night, the airspace revert to Miami Center. So we have to be aware that during those operations, there's different separation standards, different requirements, so we have to be mindful of that also. The last bullet, significant amount of VFR traffic in the local area. And the point there is they're VFR, they're operating legally under VFR rules, but they're not in control with controllers. So that's something also we have to be mindful of also when we're looking at this.
You had the Class C chart up earlier, Joanne, in your briefing, and the island, I believe I have this right, I don't normally say this that assertively, but the island's just outside the Class C. So that's typically where we're separating controlled aircraft from uncontrolled, and I'm assuming you see your share of VFR traffic over the island as well.
And like I said, this slide is just to demonstrate the confined airspace. You're looking at all the airspace in the local area. Arrivals are green, departures are red, and then just others is going to be it's kind of a little bit hard to tell where you got a few kind of yellow in there also.
Now, what could an other possibly be? You're arriving, you're departing, or what's the other?
You got like overflights. Overflights,
Okay.
yes, overflights.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I just
Not UFOs.
I was hoping it was going to be something like that. Made this more interesting.
So these are some of the discussion we're actually looking into, that, you know, to kind of facilitate some possible changes. These are some that we can do now, and some will take a little bit longer. Part of that is to review the traffic, the SOP for improvement opportunities. That's an opportunity just to review what's actually captured in the procedures, see if we can find ways to improve. You know, those are, sometimes those could be easy fixes. They don't take a long time. If we find some deficiencies, sometimes that's just a change that can be made within a few weeks, and sometimes maybe a month. We can actually, I'm sorry.
I know we're tag teaming. That's what I'm calling it when I interrupt. From the local facility perspective, one of the statistics that stood out was the 70-ish% versus 60 and down into the maybe 30s. I don't know if I have those right, but the how many aircraft are, I want to make sure I have that stat right in my head, but that was the stat on how many of the aircraft at night are above 3,000, I believe. And Chubby, you mentioned that there are different separation standards when the center has it. It's a different type of facility, but is there a reason that we are aware of why more of the flights would be at 3,000 or above when Fort Myers has control versus Miami Center having control? Is there a simple answer to that?
Yep, so when Miami Center has the airspace, the aircraft, it's basically one in, one out. So instead of more of a sequence, the aircraft, to touch on the runway, the aircraft are choosing the runway. So they could say that we prefer runway 24, but if an aircraft requests runway 6, Miami Center is still just clearing them to the airport. So like he said, they're doing a lot of things at once. So instead of hitting these noise points like Fort Myers approach does, they're clearing the aircraft for a visual approach or an instrument approach, and then just putting the aircraft on the advisory frequency. So there's not nearly the control at the smaller level that Fort Myers approach does. So as soon as it's over to Miami Center, they're working, imagine, probably from just south of Orlando all the way down into the Bahamas. So for them, obviously I live in Fort Myers, it's very important, but for them to have the specific attention to detail that Fort Myers approach does, that leads to aircraft being lower.
And in that case, you know, altitude is really critical too, because a flight at over 3,000 feet at 1 in the morning is not nearly as bad as one at 1,400 feet. 2,000 feet, as you know, I mean, just exponentially different experience for the homeowner. Who's trying to sleep.
Can I just clarify that? So do you mean that Miami is navigating the aircraft into Fort Myers?
At night, yes.
At night, so from midnight to 6 a.m., Miami Center has the airspace.
Because we don't have that, we don't have that ability?
Our control tower's closed.
Your
So
control.
the controllers in Miami Center are taking over. And they're aware of the noise mitigation programs that we have. But the problem is, you know, we'll tell them runway 24 is the operational runway to use, and the pilots will come back and say, we have an operational necessity to land runway 6. We're out of it.
And you're
we
out of it.
cannot overstate, we cannot go
that's
over
a big
pilot
deal.
and say, okay, I don't care, you're
Got
out
it.
runway 24. He has
And
an
what
operational
time
necessity.
does our tower close?
Midnight.
Midnight.
It's opens up at 6.
Opens at
And the
6.
other issue, by FAA, it's 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., whereas for RSW, we're actually functioning earlier at 6 a.m. And we get, you know, we've talked about that, why the difference in the definition of night time for RSW and any potential impacts. But I know that RSW is really working hard on the, you know, as much as they can to to control these flights, and that part of that is really just trying to work with Miami and the problems that you've stated we recognize. But to us, whatever the reason is, it's still our health experience.
So Chubby had a note earlier. I interrupted at this point because it was talking about the SOPs and improvement opportunities. So there's always training. There can be turnover at the facility. What is the right phraseology? I think that's part of what's embedded in this, and that's why I brought it up at that point. And I really didn't understand, but I appreciate the answer that, I mean, the tower closes here because of assessments of traffic levels. It doesn't mean that an individual flight isn't an impact to a homeowner, but because of how the FAA assesses operational need, there's a difference in needing controllers to separate aircraft versus managing them for noise, and that's why that distinction's occurring. at night. But there may be opportunities we can look at beyond the local facility over to Miami. And I think that's embedded in that bullet.
Thank you. That is interesting.
Also, second one is varied runway usage program and for North Bay. That's part of that discussion. That's kind of left to that building and everything. So there's chances to review that, chances for improvement. A lot of that is just actually, sometimes it's just having that discussion. And as he said, because, I come from the center background, so the way our traffic was, a few times we had took over coast control, during the mid shift, just the operation is totally different. The focus, an aircraft comes over, they get the airport in sight, we're gonna clear for the vision. Whereas if the terminal is running, they may have more where aircrafts are gonna be competing traffic, and maybe a more focus on actually having an aircraft to fly the full procedure. So you get that a little bit more deterrent, more along the same lines. Revisit development of the RNAV GPS or the RAP procedure for runway 6. That was part of the discussion, and we have a slide a little bit later where we kind of talk a little bit about that. And the note here, like I said, when we started, any changes to flight path was subject to meet the community engagement requirements. So that's one thing we want to we keep talking about that because anything we do, that is part of the discussion we have to do. And this is just one of the proposed mitigations we were talking about. I want to at least just bring something we're looking at, for a possible solution. This is the RP, and as you see, it's going to be more of a defined flight path. So that's the thing you got to be aware of for the aircraft air-to-air transition. That path is going to be the same. So you don't get a variance if the aircraft is allowed to follow the full procedure. So that's a proposed mitigation discussions around it.
So I'm sorry, what did you mean there when, I didn't understand that, just say it again.
You talking about flight path?
Whatever you're talking about.
Okay. Let me go back
Say that again.
Let me maybe go back to this one and maybe it'll show a little bit different. So if you look at this, this is going to be, you see the variance in the different colors of the
Yeah,
flight path?
yeah.
Okay. So if you look at it from that angle, so you see all the different turning points, that's a lot of work. Some of those are because of this, the aircraft there, they're making the descent. Some of it has to do with controllers maybe doing vectoring. Now this procedure, what we are just, if the aircraft is allowed to follow the procedure, and it's a term I think we used earlier, the railroad, that's what you're gonna get aircraft that are gonna be within that variance, a few miles of that track. So that's one thing when we talk about the RFP procedure. And we'll see that when we start talking about the benefits and the challenge. So you're gonna get more of a defined flight path. And where that's important, as you send up into developing this procedure, just be aware of the area that they're gonna be going over. That's really I think, to make it simple. As we're designing the procedures, we just gotta be aware of that area. Most of those tracks are gonna come, this is just a proposal, so be aware of that. I guess I wanna make sure that this is just a proposal. This is not something that's set in stone, but we just have this as an example.
Right, and if you did that, then we don't have to worry about 3,000 feet over Fort Myers Beach.
I can say that with 100%, certain.
Well, not much, but I mean, what you're proposing, I'm assuming, is to have the majority of the aircraft come in over the bay.
Yeah, it would be more of a design flight path than in that situated piece.
Yeah, and that's what would be ideal, then we don't have to worry about how high.
So I don't wanna give you, make them say that you will have no paths there.
Well, yeah.
And then the community involvement piece, I mean, you can imagine we could sit in rooms like this and draw charts that would, draw thunderous applause in one part of a city or a region, and then, we go out coated in tomatoes from another part of town.
Yeah.
So
We're very well
as we
aware of that.
talked about, the broader discussion is important to us. We also have environmental restrictions and environmental justice. But if we can find that sweet spot, I mean, and I'm using general terms, if people say, just stay over the water, the highway, the industrial park, and I'm being general across the FAA, if we can find those places working with a broader community, that's a win for everybody.
Right.
And if we have a shorter flight track, then everybody's on board.
And again, just proposals, so just, something to start the discussion, that's the main focus.
Don't do my happy dance yet.
And that's for the R&D, and the same thing for the proposed RNAV GPS, where you just get more of a defined track. So that's the thing to be aware of. That's the advantage of those. You see where it's more defined track on that. So, and again, same thing. You just have to be aware of any environmental concerns. Moving any tracks, changing any altitudes. That's always going to be part of the discussion.
So in general, and I think that's the last slide, right?
Well, we just got the benefits. I've
Oh, okay.
the benefits.
Okay.
So that's really should be where we talk about the benefits, and I've kind of talked about them as I went along. That's the biggest one. Like I said, the procedures around will be over, they boarding the beach, but actually potential noise will create over the mainland. Aircraft will return in for a longer period of time because of just the turn and the distance from the airport. Possibly could be at a lower altitude, and the possibility of likely be used 24/7 because of the different operations with the tower and with the center, and also consider the fleet mix and the requirements. So those are the same for both procedures.
So if
Thank
I
you.
could, and it's not my meeting, but I'd love to
It is
have
your
any
meeting.
feedback.
It's because you picked the date we're here. Thank you,
I'd love
sir.
to hear any feedback that the airport has, as well as thoughts that the facility may have been holding until this point. And I'm not saying they have any, but if they want to clarify or expand on anything. And then I do have a couple other thoughts, but I don't want to be the only one talking.
Sure. I did have a couple thoughts. One thing I did want to mention that came out of the meeting that we had with the chief pilots, that was a couple months ago.
Correct.
That was probably the easiest thing to do. Is I can just send you a letter that we sent to the FAA in support of what one of the requested changes is. It mirrors, I think, what Michael was just talking about. But this procedure that is out there today for the RNAV for 6, the way I understand it is that certain airlines can use this procedure and fly the procedure, and it's called the RNAV Visual Optimized Profile Descent. And I'll send you the letter so you don't have to write all that down. And the way we understand it is that certain airlines are approved to use that particular approach, which uses GPS, Global Positioning Service guidance, to help guide the aircraft. And then it also is an optimized descent, which is more of a reduced power descent, correct?
So it's quieter.
Correct. Quieter, yeah. And Southwest Airlines is working on an initiative that I think somewhat mirrors what the FAA just talked about, is to make that a public approach. So it would be not just for any particular airline, it would be available to an aircraft or crew that could use the procedure, which I think would then open it up to more aircraft or be more available to use that approach. So just we sent that letter about a month ago, and I'll just send you a copy of that. But it just, so Southwest Airlines is kind of made that request, and want to let you know that we thought it was probably a good idea. And so we'll see where the process goes from there, but that was one thing I wanted to add to that effort.
And they're saving millions.
Yeah, certainly it helps them as far as their operational needs, and I think having the technology certainly helps. With GPS approaches and everything else that's available now, but I think I didn't fully understand that there are only certain operators that had the capability or had the approval. This kind of opens it up to all aircraft operators. So
Yeah, and that's a huge opportunity.
yeah, right.
for improvement. Sorry.
No,
You're
I
just
just
speaking.
that was the one thing I wanted to raise today,
And we have that letter.
Yep. So
Great. And I don't know that we received that letter.
Yep,
If we do, I'll share it with everybody in our community.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And with regard, thank you, Chubby, for your presentation too. And I recognize also, I wondered really about the environmental impacts, and I know the FAA is sensitive to that, but I know they're also working on, you know, potential health effects of aircraft noise, like with the Partner Project 19 and different things that they're doing. And once again, we are a very environmentally oriented island. It's important to us, water quality and everything else. So, but at the same point, you know, we have our sleep disruption and particle pollution and the noise annoyance, and the health implications they're talking now, you know, with possible cardiac and diabetes and on and on. It's really quite remarkable, the potential impacts. And so I guess I just say with the FAA, once again, make sure that we're still keeping people, while protecting the environment, we're still really protecting the people. That's a significant balance. We can't let those get out of balance.
Excuse me, could I ask a question about GPS? So where are we on the conversion from what it was to total GPS?
You want to talk about that, Chevy, or no?
Is it secret?
When you say, I guess what I'm trying to make sure is that when you say total reliance on GPS, that would be the only procedure that would be in place?
Well, no, just the preferred procedure, or is it already the preferred procedure? I hear all these things out of government, you know, or Washington, you know, we're gonna change this, and well, we can't change that because somebody's gotta take the liability for this, and there's all this discussion about changing the navigational control systems, I guess.
So I guess the part that I can speak to that you know, I'm aware of on that, when it comes to going to RNAV satellite based, you still have to consider aircraft and their equipment. So,
Yeah.
you know, what aircraft or which aircraft can fly their procedure. So that's part of the discussion. Anytime you're gonna go to a satellite based navigation, you have to look at the fleet mix, the type of aircraft, who can use the procedure. And if the procedure's designed where it doesn't actually fit the need of most of the aircraft as a service in the airport or whatever, that's something you have to be aware of. So that's the part that I'm aware of, that part. But where we're at on the process of going through, I know most of the procedures now, anytime we're getting rid of a procedure, a conventional, we're not replacing most of the conventional, we're going to an RNAV. Because most carriers have proven that they can fly the RNAV procedure. So that's part of the discussion.
Jeff mentioned ADSB. Our mandate for equipage on aircraft is still, it's been January 1st, 2020 for a number of years. I don't have all the data on whether there are waivers out there for any carriers. I know there's some air carrier. I don't want to say Southwest has it easy, but it's easy to have a company like Southwest where their fleet is more consistent. But aircraft have been manufactured for more than a decade with the equipment, and maybe even 15, 20 years. Many aircraft have been equipped with the capabilities they need for satellite-based navigation, and even Southwest had it on a number of aircraft for years and didn't utilize it. There's a little bit of a chicken and egg concept that's there with how do you get the utilization up without the equipage, and why do people equip if they don't get the benefits? And part of that is being worked through, and that number will continue to climb. But that's not a specific, everybody will be doing something by a particular date. When I mentioned earlier about conflicts in the system and tools on the air traffic side, that's another component. We could have everybody equipped, everybody signed up, but if we don't have the air traffic controls to manage the conflicts and forecast those back out really into en route airspace or even back to the point of origin, that's what we're building towards. That wasn't a good sentence, but
let me just add to that. So I think the requirement that all aircraft have a satellite receiver by 2020 is just a step in the process, but that helps, you know, increase usage of GPS technology and navigation. So I think that's a positive step.
it is.
And positive for ATC too. So I think we still have the ground-based navigation. That's probably going to be with us for a while. But as a pilot, if I have a GPS in my aircraft, I certainly will use it. And, you know, been comfortable using GPS approaches, and they're easier oftentimes than even the ground-based stuff. So.
Ask one other little question. What is the relationship with the air traffic control? So what's the hierarchy of that? Does air traffic control report only to the FAA, or do they have a dotted line to you, or how does that work?
They report, air traffic controllers report to the FAA. I mean, there's a federal contract tower program where some controllers in the system at some 253 airports, I think, around the country are contract employees under a cost share, where there's a benefit of additional tower controllers, but the FAA is not fully funding that. But they report through the FAA, and the ideal balance, and I mean it when I say it, the ideal discussions are involving the community, the airport, and the FAA in those discussions. And we've seen cases before where, and they're true statements, but someone can say, oh, the aircraft are all under FAA control, or the FAA can say, but the airport built the runway. I mean, frankly, we're all in it, and we want the system to operate as efficiently as we can and meet the community needs. And I think these kinds of discussions are healthy. So, I mean, we can say we own a part of it, and I'm not absolving that. But yes, the controllers report to the FAA, and we have criteria, but we're also meeting design criteria. I mentioned Southwest earlier. It really is fascinating, and I'll do it in 30 seconds, but aircraft are more efficient than they were in the past. Aircraft used to be at higher altitudes when you're designing satellite procedures. Sometimes, you know, aircraft used to be at a higher altitude, and they'll say they don't drop like they used to. They don't descend as quickly as they used to. And so there are a lot of unique factors, and that's part of the criteria that Chevy mentioned. There's the flyability. There are a lot of factors that come in together. And then there's the mixed, am I on a satellite base? Some of the aircraft are on an RMP or an RNAV, and others are intercepting the ILS, and all that's going on in the airspace among other airports. But I think every time I saw a table in your data, I'm going to be looking at it. So part of that is my commitment. I'm going to be asking some why questions. Help me understand this, and there may be great reasons, or there may be areas we can improve. But the piece that we need to be striving for, at least in my opinion, is looking to get more aircraft on the satellite-based procedures, less conflict, less longer downwinds to the extent that we can. Nobody wants the aircraft to fly further than they have to. Look at the optimized descent and how we had some internal discussions in our meetings. Sometimes you can say, I want them at 3,500 versus 3,000, but it may be a better question to say, what's the configuration of the aircraft? And an aircraft on an OPD may be quieter at 3 than a dirty at 35.
Yeah.
So all of those discussions need to be part of the solution. And you shared a wealth of information with us today. I'm not saying you haven't shared the majority of it in the past, but it's the first. I saw some new info today.
Thank you. Thank you for being here to listen. And I know with our great relationship we have with Mr. Mulder and his staff and the Port Authority and the BOCC and working with you, we can get some things accomplished. We promise to be out of here at 11. So I guess what I want right now is some commitment to action or follow-up communication. Where will we go from here? Who will be communicating with us? Whatever. You have my contact information, Mr. O'Hara. What can we expect so that I'm not nagging you? Who's going to nag me first? I've been married for 40 years this past week, so I know the meaning of nag, so don't think I won't come after you again.
So we had some internal discussions on kind of, I hate to call them design timeframes, but that's the word that comes to mind. We have a lot of priorities, and
Sure.
That's not meant in any way to be dismissive, but there was a discussion that we legitimately could look at some of the design pieces probably late in the calendar year.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that we can't have more discussions to ensure that we're headed in the right direction. I would suggest that's appropriate in advance. So I think it makes sense for us to digest some of the materials you've had, and maybe we do touch base in a couple months and
Great.
say what are the questions.
Put
that
it
we
on my
have.
iPhone calendar and say, send you a wave.
Do we need some clarifications? Does our
Right.
data show anything different? Do we need to discuss that further? And then hopefully at that point say, all right, now let's pursue this direction.
So in the fall, sometime in the fall, I'll send you a wave and see what's coming up.
And somebody said that it's a lot, well, I don't mean that, it sounds funny the way I said it, but I don't know why we're here in the summer and stuff instead of,
Well, and next time, yes, we'll host you during, I don't know if you wanna come in spring break, but we are, October, November is the perfect month on
Yeah.
Fort Myers Beach, by the
Yeah.
way.
So Joe, I didn't give you maybe I did give you a chance, but is there anything from your perspective, any concerns or feedback from the facility?
No concerns. I mean, since I've been here, safety's always been the number one issue with the FAA. It always will be. Community involvement is also an issue that we deal with on a time. Since I've been here for 4 or 5 years, we've met probably a dozen times, either some places or some. And I think we've made great improvement with the noise, with the back approach and all that stuff. It's also, you guys have to keep in mind that RSW's airspace is the 5th airport I've been at. And it's a very complicated airspace because we have a lot of airports in it. So there's a lot of mitigating factors that go into why we do things. And it can't be answered in a short time frame of why aren't these airplanes at 3,000 or 4,000 and stuff like that. But I think the relationship is good between the community and certainly the port. I've told Mark on several occasions, and I'm not sure about Jeff, but the working relationship we have is outstanding. And I really appreciate that. And I appreciate the involvement of the community and stuff. And we're always looking at ways to improve things. And the input we get, we'll certainly take and look at it and stuff like that. But we appreciate the opportunity.
So thank you again, everybody, for being here, and it's 11:01, and we adjourn, and safe travels to everybody.
Thank you,
Thank you
gentlemen,
again.
very much, very, very much.
Thank you.